So again, welcome to this loosely titled Lobby Against Lockdown. So I think the clues there in the title. Truly heavyweights and a world-class panel, and I'll let Dean do the formal instructions. But on behalf of me, thank you everybody for choosing to do this and doing this for us. We really appreciate you giving up your time. I know how incredibly busy you all are. I've just seen all of your content, and I've seen a few of you on Question Time recently, so that's brilliant. So thank you very much from me on behalf of everyone. For you guys as well, this is a strong audience. We've got some 300 recruitment CEOs in the room here, 7,000 staff, combined revenues of over 2 billion. So it's an opportunity for you to potentially ask any questions of us en masse to give you a temperature of what our customers are talking about and UK PLC from the streets, from the cold hard streets of COVID land. So we are talking to people. Recruitment is massively cyclical, as everybody knows, and most of us actually are doing all right when Boris lets us out. It's quite hard when he doesn't let us do that. Well, given us, obviously the timing for this has been epic. I was just having a sort of reminder to myself of all the things that are going on and how many of these things are kind of COVID related. So although it's a COVID special, lockdowns and the extended lockdowns, Brexit and a potential capitulation over that, the Tory implosion, Boris, a new USA president. And we were just talking about this and Miriam just basically put me straight because I was kind of worried about what impact he might have, but no, I feel okay about that now. Spending and how much money the UK is spending on what's likely to be the result of that. We've got some issues about IR35 and stuff, but we won't touch upon that. But obviously the UK has to do something to get money back. And this whole CGT thing here has been worrying me personally. And if that were to be happening, I mean, I'm going to be out of the country. So try to protect all my assets. I was watching The Crown yesterday, just for some tips as you do. And it was season 4 and Maggie Thatcher was there. And there was a part of me as a Thatcher child who did very well under Thatcherism, thinking she wouldn't be having any of this, and she would certainly make sure her party was straight, and she would be sort of coming strong-armed through everything that was happening. So it's a worrying time. Every time there is massive change in the world, then there also comes great opportunity. So this is the chance for us to hear it from truly informed people, what this whole COVID thing means, where the impacts are, and what it could potentially do for us, or what we could do to get through this as with some sort of positive gain. So before I have another self-induced wobble about Brexit, potentially I should pass over to Dean here, who's basically been getting up at 4 o'clock every morning, reading absolutely everything, and then sharing it across all the groups. So depending on Dean's mood in the mornings, it kind of shapes our mood. It hasn't been great recently. So Dean, I'll pass on to you. I'll go on to mute, and thank you, brother, for the idea of putting this together. I hope everyone has fun. And again, thank you very much for giving up your time today. We really appreciate it. Dean, over to you.
Thank you, Gary. I suppose as we're in lockdown 2, Margaret Thatcher did say, I think, that sometimes you have to fight the battle twice. So maybe we'll get some more ammo from today. I would like to thank our esteemed panel. And rather than cover some of the stuff Gary just did, I'm going to give you some background on these individuals, many of whom you will know. So I'm going to start with Fraser Nelson. Fraser is the editor of The Spectator and a columnist for the Daily Telegraph. Seasoned journalist who throws a fascinating light over the dynamics of Westminster. And he's also a member of the advisory board of the Centre of Social Justice and Centre Politics Studies. We have our science expert in the room. We have Dr. Mike Yeadon, who, again, many of you may know from some of my posts. Dr. Yeadon has a BSc in biochemistry and toxicology and a PhD in respiratory pharmacology. He's the ex-chief scientific officer and VP of Pfizer. He's also published over 40 original research articles, and since 2011 has consulted with more than 20 biotechnology companies. James Barber Smith, again, very well known to those who were in S3, because he was once a board member there. James is currently the chairman and board advisor to a number of UK businesses, most of which are focused on rapid overseas expansion. He's the ex-head of portfolio management at Gresham Private Equity, a mid-market UK-focused PE business, where he was involved with over 50 businesses in his 16-year career, ranging from education to manufacturing. And last but not least, Merran Somerset-Webb, who you will all know, friend of the Pirates, chief editor of Money Week, FT columnist, and Ibiza show opener. So we have we have a range of questions which we've condensed from the members. Now, I've via Emma has quite nicely put these together and supplied our panel with the questions. So to keep timing and give everybody time to have a real bash at some of the questions, and we're quite open here. We want it to be a little bit informal. If you want to, as a panel, interject and throw something up, please do so. For any of the members who want to ask a question, please just go to the chat button and pop your question on there, and Emma will go through those. So I'm going to start with Merran. We spoke in the first lockdown, because you kindly did a Zoom for all of our members then, about the possibility of a V-shaped bounce once it had been relaxed. And we did see a few signs of this when it was relaxed, but unfortunately the government's corona coaster, as we're calling it, is still going, and so is their largesse. So the first question there is, do you think we will see a V-shaped bounce once lockdown has been dropped, or has too much damage already been done?
I think the first thing to say there, we've already seen an awful lot of a V-shaped bounce. I mean, that's genuinely happened. You know, if you look at retail sales now, they're back where they were, for example, pre-pandemic, above where they were pre-pandemic. So we've had that V. What we're really hoping for now is a W with a very little dip in the middle, if you see what I mean. The way that I'm explaining it at the moment is to say that we need to think about it in terms of pent-up demand. And pent-up demand is one of the things that I've spent the last 20 years telling people does not exist and cannot ever exist. You either have demand, which is when people can afford to buy something and they want that thing, they go out and buy it. Or you have hopes and dreams, which is when people feel like they kind of fancy something and they can't afford it. The idea of pent-up demand, that there are people who want something they can afford but they can't go out and get, it's never existed. It exists right now. Now, for the first time in my career anyway, you have something you can genuinely call pent-up demand. We have household finances that are very significantly improved since the beginning of the pandemic. You know, there's a majority of households have kept their income either the same or higher, and also a majority of households have seen their spending fall fairly dramatically. So their costs have fallen. And interestingly, this is also the case at the bottom end. So if you look at what the ONS term as, or Bank of England, term as inactive people in the economy, so the unemployed and the retired, etc., 90% of them have held their income exactly where it was pre-pandemic, and 60% of them have seen their expenses fall. So across the board, you see improved household finances, and you see people unable to get out and spend the money that they want to spend. So this is pent-up demand. It's there, it's real, it's strong. And I think that the second we are allowed out again, the second that the vaccine is in place, or the second we stop fiddling around keeping everyone in lockdown, we will see this huge burst of energy come through. You know, I saw a note yesterday, Capital Economics, one of the research groups that I follow, saying that they expect the tourist season in Spain, for example, next year, significantly better than it was last year, because everyone will take more holidays next year than they did before. So there's a lot of good news there. And with the vaccine, we can now, instead of looking at the bad news, we can look through all that dislocation to what will happen next. So I am still a believer, not necessarily in the V anymore, because it's got a little wobbly around the second up switch. But that energy is still there. The other thing I would add to that is that one of the things we've been waiting for in the UK for a decade plus is an up-pop in productivity. Our productivity gains have been almost non-existent for years and years and years. And there's a constant discussion about why. And I think that, well, I hope, shall I say, that what we will see as we come out of this pandemic is that one of the silver linings is that we will see improved productivity. So the entire population has, for example, been on technology crash course. The trends that will eventually get rid of our zombie companies have been really accelerated. So if you look, for example, look at the firms that have announced job losses this week alone. you see things like, or going into administration, should I say. So you see things like, I don't know, Jaeger, Peacocks, that kind of thing. These are companies that have been on the way out for years. They have too many physical shops. They don't have an online presence. Their branding is appalling. They've been on the way out for a long time. Now, instead of this being dragged out over another 2 years, they're just going. So you see a lot of acceleration I hope, in the cleaning out of zombie companies from the UK economy. And we will start things, hopefully, cleaner and more productive with this pent-up demand behind us in the spring. So I'm sounding weirdly optimistic, I know, but I am.
Maren, it's James here. Can I just say, it's interesting what I've been seeing from the businesses I've been talking to. And this productivity thing, I think, is fascinating, because what we've been doing in our businesses through through this year has effectively been changing the business from one that has, these businesses have just progressed from year to year and not really made fundamental changes. They've just carried on going because it's too difficult. There's too much to be done to make a big change. Because of COVID, you've been forced to batten down the hatches. And what we've done is we've reset ourselves. Where do we need to be in 5 years' time? So that has meant lots of redundancies. It's made lots of other changes that are coming through, but actually the businesses are a lot fitter and will come through it a lot fitter in the big change. And so therefore, I think your productivity point will come through quite quickly by sort of middle to late next year.
I think there's another interesting point to make there, which is that as the weaker companies fall out, the stronger companies get a much better market position. So you'll see happening at the moment an awful lot of companies that maybe a year ago were going, well, there's quite a lot of competition in the sector. How do we deal with this? Coming out the other end with fewer competitors, stronger competitors, and there you might see margins rising as well. I mean, in the airline industry, for example, Jet2, when they raised money at the beginning of this whole palaver, they did it specifically because they wanted to have a big pile of money in the bank so that they could be the ones who came out on top in an environment where others were failing. It's all so interesting.
And more companies go bust in the upswing than in the downswing. So we will see more of that coming through, which will then lead to that efficiency coming through in due course.
And that will result, of course, in higher unemployment. And that's not to be just sort of shoved to one side because there's silver linings here. There will be higher unemployment, and that will affect consumer confidence a little, I guess, around the edge.
Okay, and obviously with the additional unemployment, that sends productivity up as well, doesn't it, in itself? Gary and I have spoken many times recently about the businesses we work with that have got to know their business better during this COVID period because they've had to get a handle on their cash. The hubris has gone, and they really have become better machines because of it. So I hope the positivity there does roll on and we do see that W. The second question we've got for you, Maren, as a whole under COVID, it seems very much from the outside looking in that we're almost sacrificing the young, the next generation, the jobs and whatever else for the old or sometimes the very old. And I think I read a couple of days ago that the a calculation by the IMF showed that the G20 has spent 11 trillion on COVID support already, and that will continue to go up. And that countries like Italy had run out of money. 40 to 80% of UK businesses were probably going to default on their government-backed loans. So a question we've asked you before, and I think you've given us some very detailed answers on this before, but looking at post-COVID, do you think there's a real prospect of a debt jubilee? And is the future for Western governments the magic money tree or modern monetary theory of just keep printing money?
Okay, so I'm guessing you don't want a really detailed answer this time, right?
No, that's fine.
Debt jubilees. I mean, I think that there will be private debt jubilees. We were talking about this earlier. We have to get rid of the level of private debt across the global economy. So you are going to see, I suspect, jubilees in the forms of things like the cancellation of student debt, which we have talked about before. How do governments get rid of this debt? Well, there are. If you remove the magic money tree, remove modern monetary theory from the equation for the moment, and just assume that we have to get rid of debt in the way that we've always had to get rid of debt, there is, in the end, only one real way for economies like ours to deal with it, and that is to do exactly what we did post-war, which is to go through a period of inflation combined with financial repression. So we allow prices to rise, we push prices to rise, we want inflation to rise, and at the same time, we want to lower the real value of our government debt, and we do that by forcing bond yields down. By forcing bond yields to stay lower than they would otherwise, which means that we can gradually erode the value of the debt compared to inflation. And there are hints of that coming already. I don't know. These are things that I think possibly most people won't have noticed yet. But you saw, for example, the Bank of England talking the other day about how important it is to encourage savers to be included in the reconstruction and recovery of the economy post-COVID. And then we saw Rishi Sunak saying something similar. He's got a big infrastructure fund that he wants to set up, that he wants us all to put our pension money into. And guess what happens when you do that? You effectively hold government bonds. You are forced into government financing at a low rate. So this is gradually the beginning of the financial repression that I think I've been talking to you all about for a couple of years now. This is the only way out. This is the way we will go. And you're beginning to see the little hints of that happening again. Is something that's been accelerated by COVID, which is it's exciting if you've been looking for it, but rather depressing if you didn't know about it. So that's the way that this will happen in a normal world. Now, modern monetary theory is the idea that you don't need to do any of this stuff. You can just keep printing money indefinitely if you have control of your central bank and some global confidence in your markets. You just keep printing and you don't worry about it until you see inflation rising. And then when you see the risk of inflation rising, you dive in and you don't have to use interest rates. What you can do is you can use taxes to control the way consumers and businesses are behaving and then push down inflation and everything's absolutely fine. Now, a lot of people have begun to believe in this theory, and it doesn't at this point really matter whether you believe in it or not, because if there's anything that I have learned in the last 25 years is that what you want doesn't matter. You have to prepare for what is actually going to happen. And we are moving into an era where I think you could say that fiscal and monetary policy are about to become one. And there will be printing, and that will lead to inflation, because the bit where clever academics say you need to pull back now, the inflation is coming, and the politicians listen and say, you're absolutely right, we'll do that. That bit will never happen. So yes, MMT is on the way. And yes, the end result of that over the medium term is inflation. In the shorter term, you have to expect a degree in the UK at least, and probably in the US, of financial repression. Was that too detailed?
No, as always, perfect.
Back to inflation is coming.
Inflation is coming. Well, that'd be good for my savings accounts. Great. Finally.
Well, that's financial repression, not making any return on your inflation account. The interest rate on your inflation account is well below inflation. You're losing money every day.
Well, that's nothing new at the moment, I think. I'm going to move to Fraser. I had a quick chat with Fraser last week, and we talked about the Spectator data hub and the amount of data and COVID data that you've been analysing, and some of the findings you put out for me seem to debunk some of the projections from government and Sage. And you obviously, within the Spectator, publishing a wide range of articles from all different standpoints, from eminent professors and experts. So the first of the two-part question is, in terms of what you've been through in data and in terms of the articles, what is the most compelling article or data set that you've seen for no more lockdowns? And with what I've just said in mind about the Spectator, and I'm sure many in government read the Spectator, well-respected magazine, why hasn't this been a platform for some change in their thought process?
Well, we started to do the data hub because we at the Spectator use metrics quite a lot. I used to be a financial journalist like Merrin, and not nearly as good as her. But when I was, when you're a financial journalist, you don't come to conclusions without trying to look up the figures to work out whether you're correct or not. When I moved into politics, I was amazed to see the extent to which huge decisions are taken without any really recourse to evidence, without anyone trying to work out, well, for example, if I have a pupil premium and I give pure pupils more money, is that going to improve their educational output or not? And it turns out that it doesn't. But still, you're amazed how billions of pounds can be poured into experiments which don't work without anybody really working out whether they work or not. And now that is bad policy making at the best of times. But when you're deciding whether to lock down a country or not, I mean, listening to Merrin there was easily the most optimistic view I've heard about what's happening right now. The vision I see, and perhaps Merrin can tell me why I'm being a bit too gloomy, is in an economy where 1 million jobs have gone so far, with perhaps 1 million more jobs still yet to go, lots of businesses which might get put to the wall, all sorts of social and economic damage. I see educational inequality, for example, hugely worsened over lockdown, because you've got houses like mine where all my kids had a laptop each, they had a room each to study. And there'll be so many houses in this country where they'll be lucky to have a single iPhone per household to do their homework. And we know that those kids are not getting the damage of their education repaired. And they'll probably be pushed through without any exams even next year. So we can all pretend not to look at the damage. So what we thought we would do at The Spectator is try to keep track, because the government is getting a bit better now at releasing data. But what they do is they do a massive data dump. So there'll be a spreadsheet somewhere and you'll be able to query the data, but nobody puts it together. Nobody can be bothered. To me, it's a bit of a fault line, really, in journalism. The FT is good at data, but the FT is very pro-lockdown. So the only graphs the FT tends to put together are ones which support the lockdown policy. I've never quite worked out why the FT would be pro-lockdown. But I guess there was a poll last year showing half of FT readers would vote Jeremy Corbyn. So you needn't always assume that the paper of finance is necessarily pro-capitalist. My point being, there was a gap in the market for coming up with metrics and figures which try to take an evidence-based view as to whether lockdown works. Now, you asked what jumps out at those figures. What jumps out at me is the lack of any link between the trajectory of the infections and the policies adopted by government. For example, if you go on to the latest data.spectator.co.uk, you'll see that COVID infections were going down in the week before lockdown. But when lockdown started, then infections start to level out, which doesn't make sense on the face of it. Then you can look at we've also got a tier 3 section of the data website where we look at various cities that were in tier 3. Now, some of them, like Liverpool, were coming down way before they were put into tier 3, and that trajectory was unabated by lockdown. Then you have other places where the infections started to come down exactly when they were put into tier 3. But what you notice is that correlation is not causation. And you look in vain here for any evidence that lockdown works and what it's supposed to do, which is to curb the rates of the virus. Now, I've been trying to use my contacts here as a political journalist to go behind the scenes and to talk to people on SAGE, on the Joint Biosecurity Committee, and to ask them, look, can you tell me what metrics you're using that informs your policy? Because nothing which you published gives any evidence at all that it's actually working. And sometimes they can give pointers. For example, the infection rates of the over 60s is something that they look at. Well, great, we can look at them too, and we find out they're coming down in the places where the government's supposed to be most worried about NHS capacity. Then you look at NHS capacity. We did something yesterday showing the occupation of hospitals. That found that the worst possible COVID day, on the 8th of April, when COVID cases were at their peak in the NHS, 40% of beds were lying empty in the NHS. So it wasn't overrun. And right now, when you look at what's happening, the NHS is actually less busy than it was this time last year. Intensive care beds are significantly more likely to be empty now than they were last year. So again, you have to ask, where is the healthcare crisis that the government points to? Now, we all know, anybody who's done any investigations or any work in data will know that everybody is susceptible to bias. You start out with a hunch, and then you've got the temptation exists in your subconscious to, rather than do evidence-based policy making, you start to do policy-based evidence making. That I think of myself as being an objective seeker of the truth, but what happens if I am just going on a hunt for figures which back up my thesis that lockdown doesn't work and that the government is pursuing the wrong strategy? So I try to be as open-minded as I can and to publish figures which prove some of my suspicions wrong. For example, deaths on the 9th of November, they peaked at 450 a day. Now that's quite a lot. There was a time in September where I thought they would never get to 450 a day. And also, if you look at Sweden, there was a while where I thought that Sweden had such a heavy dose of the virus, but it was unlikely to get it significantly again. I was wrong there. The virus has come back quite significantly in Sweden, although all they're doing is introducing a rule of 8. It's nothing like the rest of the economy. And then you try to find out, the real point here is that Sweden's economy is going to go down 3.4% this year compared to 12% for Britain. When you look at the non-COVID deaths, the excess deaths, because I've also found out that arguing about the economy is unpersuasive. You're not going to win any arguments about lockdown by saying, what about the economy? Because that sounds like you're a selfish capitalist talking about money where other people are talking about lives. So that's not the way I talk about it now, nor is it the way I see it. I think this is about lives versus lives. You'll notice every time the government makes a case for a lockdown, it does this great slide presentation where we'll see these scary graphs. One of the graphs that we had making the case for lockdown suggested that by today, there would be as many as 4,000 COVID deaths a day rather than 450. They were ludicrous, but you never see any graphs about the side effects of lockdown, about the cancer deaths, about the heart disease. We in the Spectator published figures showing that A&E usage is half what it used to be. So that's half as many people, for example, presenting for acute triaged heart failures. Now, nobody believes that there are fewer people actually experiencing these, but we now know they're simply less likely to go to hospital to seek the help they need. So we're trying to build a data series now that will complete the picture for non-COVID deaths, the crisis in our public health. We're planning perhaps a cover story for the Spectator next week called The Third Wave. The third wave meaning the non-COVID deaths, which are likely to come and hit the health service because people haven't been seeking the primary care that they need. Now, you also asked why isn't anybody in government acting on this? And I'll give you my best guess. My best guess is that even Boris Johnson doesn't know how Number 10 operates. He was devolving far too much to Dominic Cummings. Dominic Cummings was quite pro-lockdown. And that lot, Number 10, were very keen, but the Prime Minister only actually saw figures that made the case for lockdown. If you have a look at the graphs that were presented in that ridiculous Halloween press conference, they were of such dire quality. The data there would never have been passed to any board meeting of any of the companies joining us on this call today. It was appallingly bad. Yet not only was it presented to the Prime Minister, it was presented to the country to make the case for lockdown. So what's happening is that you get a dysfunction within government. The Treasury is pretty good. You might disagree with what they're doing about capital gains tax, but they will properly score this. They will properly come up with projections. They will come up with competent data. This simply isn't being done with public health. SAGE is a mess. We learned in Panorama last night that SPI-M, which is the modeling division of SAGE, was actually going to Wikipedia to get some of its figures because it had such little clue about COVID. The figures being spurged out by SAGE are going through to the Cabinet Office. The Cabinet Office is incompetent, but jealously hoards its monopoly power over the virus information. And there is nobody. The other thing, when I asked around government, I was saying, who there? Okay, I know who's doing the forecasts for the virus. It's SAGE, it's SPI-M, it's a joint biosecurity committee. But tell me there's a committee somewhere that's keeping the score for lockdown cases, that's keeping the score for heart disease, for extra cancer deaths. Tell me there's somebody there having a chart showing the Prime Minister, yes, you can lock down if you want, Prime Minister, but this is the price you will pay in terms of extra public health risks. And it turns out there isn't a single person doing that. The Treasury, I found out a couple of days ago, hasn't even estimated the financial impact of a second lockdown. Now, you might think to yourself, God, that is staggeringly incompetent. If I were a finance director and we were about to go in a massive project, there's no way anybody didn't do a reforecast when you went into lockdown. So why didn't the Treasury? The answer to that is simply the methods of government. The methods of government would bankrupt any financial company. What's happened was that Rishi Sunak was having a conversation on a Thursday morning, you might have to tighten restrictions. Then suddenly, 24 hours later on a Friday, the conversation went straight to having to lock down. There wasn't time for anybody in the Treasury to do a calculation about the cost of lockdown. As a result, that decision was taken without the government balancing it. Now, as journalists, you always think, what's our role in society? Journalists can't solve problems. I wish that we could. We can't even really come out with solutions. We can publish solutions. We can hope people adopt them. But really, I'm not a policymaker. If I was running the Treasury, I'm not sure I'd do a particularly good job at it. What journalists can do is shine a light on problems that government doesn't want to see. And in my case, that's the publication of this data. I just want there to exist somewhere a place people can go to find out the other side of the COVID story, the side which policymakers aren't really looking at. I can just make sure that for those who want to look, they can find it, because that's more than I think the government is doing at the moment. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No. It was a great answer. Sorry, Mike, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I think if you're ready, I think it would be a great time. So I don't want to comment on it because I'll use up all the time. But if you want to, it'd be just a perfect tee up from Fraser to come to me, if you would like.
Okay. I have another question for Fraser, but I can go back to Fraser. I can go back to Fraser afterwards if it leads on. That's fine.
I think it would. I think it absolutely does. So thank you, Fraser. I think your description of what's going on inside government, I find it frightening. So I'm a private individual. I was introduced. I've been a professional scientist all of my life, and one small attribute that was missed from my description is that. After leaving Pfizer as their vice president, head of respiratory research worldwide, that's because they fired me when they closed their site in the UK. I became an entrepreneur, and for 5 years, I was the founding CEO of a biotech company called Ziarco, and I was unburdened by knowledge of how difficult it was to raise private finance, so I just did it, and I raised $50 million in 2 continents, hired a team. I had a compound I'd managed to acquire for buttons from Pfizer because it was very early stage, nobody wanted it. And after 5 years, we'd done a clinical trial, probably bigger than, and never mind. I did a clinical trial, it worked really well, and there was a bit of a bidding war, and Novartis, the world's biggest pharmaceutical company, bought us. And so my investors were very happy. They, just for the sake of the numbers, they got a 10x exit, some of them in 6 months. So I think they were pretty happy. Especially the one that put in a convertible note to give us some runway in case we didn't get sold. So these guys managed to push like $20 million in at the last minute, and they got 10x back. Anyway, so I was very happy to do that, and it's why I'm now sitting here in France. I'm in a nice apartment in Nice. So so what have I been doing since then? So I've done almost nothing else except think about and get involved in conversations about coronavirus since about late March, really. So I'll just give you a couple of background bits. It may be a surprise to you or not, but you should know this, that when we swim in a sea of viruses, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of viruses, including a large number of which we're unaware, and we've no sequences for them. So we don't know where they are. There's probably some you're breathing in right now. We're very good at living with most viruses most of the time. And because most viruses are related to other viruses, then when a new one is identified, like it was earlier this year or the end of last year, people like me went straight to the sort of gen bank and looked at the sequences because I expected to find it would be related to other things our body had seen, and therefore there would be something called prior immunity. People who'd been exposed to related things would be fine. And I looked at the databases and loads of prior immunity evidence, so I thought everything will be well, it'll wash over us, go away. Of course, nothing like this has happened. And that's because I don't understand why, but the SAGE in particular just hasn't followed normal science as far as I'm concerned. So, and then the other thing I should tell you is, because people don't seem to know this, that once you've been infected by an ordinary respiratory virus, so forget sort of extraordinary political circumstances, this is an ordinary virus. That is, it doesn't mutate quickly like flu. So it's the same virus when you see it in 6 months or 6 years, I should think. And it doesn't poison your immune system like HIV. So if you see it, you'll easily handle it. Almost everybody wins the battle. And then here's the key point, you become immune. It's not an argument about it. It's not sometimes, it's not a political debate. That's how your immune system works. Essentially, it cuts up the invading into little bits. It finds a T cell that matches it by a miracle. You'll find loads. They expand and they become your surveillance, and they never forget a face. So think of it as having taken a picture of the invader and never forget a face. When it turns up again, bang, you won't get ill. So you can't get infected, or at least you can't get ill twice, and you don't take part in transmission. So with these two concepts, that it's very common to have lots of prior immunity in the population, and that once infected, you become immune, you're out of the game. You would think that this new virus should wash over the country and then that would be it. And I believe that is what happened. So in spring, this not very novel virus, 80% similar to a virus that's in existence, quite similar to 4 viruses that you get common colds from. They're called common cold causing coronaviruses, and they're all around all the time. About 1 in 30 of us has got it right now on this call. So as this novel-ish virus swept over the country, it did kill 40,000 people, almost all of whom were old or very old and already ill or very ill. So the average age of death was 83. The average number of severe chronic illnesses was 2.5. So let me just finish, or I'll never get through this. There is no doubt whatever, and I saw my first paper within 3 weeks of lockdown that showed that somewhere about 40% of the people had already prior immunity. Since then, there have been 7 papers, and I would say the median estimate now is about 50% prior immunity. And even Public Health England published a few days ago a paper that showed between, in my view, 25% and 50%. And that means not many people needed to get infected and become immune in order that herd immunity was reached. And I believe, and I am in the majority with scientists who believe that prior herd immunity at a national level was reached during May. The risks to this virus, even if you were to catch it now, if you're less than 70 years old, is far less than common seasonal flu. So if I was any other year but 2020, you wouldn't be hearing this talk because it's so dull. But if this was 2018 and I've given a talk to a learned society, they would go, well, that's interesting, Mike, but next talk, please. But that isn't what happened. As we came towards the wave arriving, we had this extraordinary committee, and they didn't have any cellular immunologists. They didn't even have an ordinary person, scientist like me, on it. And so for some reason, they projected 500,000 people would die, which is absurd. You probably don't know this, but let me briefly tell you. 3 Nobel Prize winners, none of them from Britain, confidentially wrote to Professor Ferguson to say, you're completely wrong. Let me show you why you're wrong. And one of them, Michael Levitt, produced an estimate of about 40,000 deaths, which is in fact what we had. And I'll say it in a bit more in a moment. So, and even a smart person who's not on SAGE was able to determine roughly what was going to happen. And he was right. It wasn't lucky. You could do it easily. But so SAGE said lots of nasty things are going to happen. And then for the first time ever, the country decided that running and hiding from a highly infectious respiratory virus was a good idea. It's of course absurd. We've never done it before and it doesn't work, as Fraser says. They also introduced the Coronavirus Act 2020, which, if you've heard Jonathan Sumption, basically it's a takeover of the country by stealth. They have provided the executive with, I would say, extraordinary powers that would be matched only in wartime. And there's simply no rationale for that. And what he also pointed out is that they provided themselves with a budget to cope with emergencies 10 times bigger than any prior emergency. That is half of the annual budgets available. So when you see money being splurged around on projects that you're not really sure about, well, neither am I, and that's where the money's come from. It's your money. The thing that really upset me, and is the reason why people like me are not heard at all on the BBC or anywhere else, is they brought in the Ofcom coronavirus broadcasting guidelines, and they did that on March the 23rd, which was the day of lockdown. And Fraser, I've often wondered how it was that they managed to negotiate this tightly worded 4-page document with the Fourth Estate in, I don't know, in a few hours' time, but more of that anon. But the effect of it is censorship. I would not be able to appear on any of the mainstream channels, even though I've published 40 papers and I'm a coherent person, and I'm telling you, you're being misled. The next thing is that having decided that lockdown was a good idea, we're now suffering from, I believe, extreme loss of liberty, that for all reasons that they claim are related to the virus, and I'll explain in a moment why that's not true, you're prevented sometimes from moving from county to county, or in my case, I can't even come home. I'm in France, I'm a British citizen. If I come home, it's illegal for me to leave because I don't have a reason pertaining to work or education. So I'm not coming home. I'm not coming home to Britain until they remove that repressive law. Then finally, I should say that for the first time in human history, we decided to let a machine, the PCR polymerase chain reaction results, define whether you were ill or not, whether you were infected or not, whether you were infectious or not, and have lots of consequences for you in terms of liberty. And all of this stuff is surprising, shall we say. I don't know why they've done all of this. I'm simply pointing out that they have. Then the thing that happened after the first wave, 40,000 deaths, I've talked about prior immunity, I've talked about a small percentage were required to become infected, and then that had too few people susceptible left for an epidemic to break out again, which is true. But Ferguson and others and the BBC and then the Prime Minister started talking about the second wave. You're all familiar with the second wave because you've had it morning, noon and night since about May. Now, I just need to point out, as a scientist, I was astonished from the first day I heard it, because with the exception of the oddities after the First World War, where more people were moved around than ever before in human history, and lots of people got ill, and they decided to call that 2 or 3 waves of flu, which it probably wasn't. But other than that, there's no evidence whatsoever that viruses do waves. So I keep telling people, viruses don't do waves, you know. If you think differently, please show me the scientific medical literature. I've even said so to SAGE, saying, in order to project a second wave, you must have had an evidential basis of foundational literature. Please tell me what it is. No one has either corrected my statement that viruses don't do waves or provided any evidence. So I believe someone decided there was going to be one, because there's never been one in history and there's no mechanism for it to happen. And I've just told you that we have herd immunity in the country, except for perhaps a couple of corners, I do believe in Liverpool, that there was simply no way that you could get an epidemic outbreak again. And I don't know whether they did it on purpose or by mistake, but they've accidentally made it happen by centralizing PCR testing into small factories called lighthouse labs. And you may have seen some disclosures from people working on the inside of these things that they're simply not very clean, they're not very well run. I believe that the level of contamination inevitably during that process means that you shouldn't believe any of the data that comes from lighthouse labs. I think it probably overestimates cases by between 5-fold and 40-fold. I can't guess closer than that. The government has no control of this system whatsoever. They've hosed these places with money. No one is checking them. But it's solely on the basis of the product of these factors that you are being told that there are cases, that you are told that there are deaths. Because remember, the deaths are simply deaths within 28 days of someone who's tested positive. So I don't think there's an end. Somebody asked me, when will it end? And I've said, when SAGE decides to. It's not a natural phenomenon anymore. They're not measuring a natural phenomenon. And then when you come to excess death, so I spent an hour on a Zoom call earlier with an expert pathologist, a diagnostic pathologist and a biostatistician. And we believe that there's probably a small number of genuine COVID deaths, a small number, not the 500 you're being told about every day, maybe 50, 80, something really quite small. And the bulk of the rest of them are misclassified people who are your brothers, your sisters, your fathers, your fellow citizens who are dying because of 8 months of lack of access to NHS healthcare. And if you didn't have the PCR test running and just looked at symptoms instead, no one would say they died of a severe acute respiratory virus. So that's the backdrop, and I have no idea why they're doing it, and I never get into conspiracy theories. But this has not happened by accident. It's gone on far too long. It's deliberate, and I believe there's a few solutions, but I don't know how to do it. The way to stop this, of course, if I'm right, and I'll just say a couple of minutes why I think I'm right, I think we should halt PCR mass testing in the community tomorrow, if not yesterday. And that's for the reasons I've stated, that it's simply not reliable. And I've got 5 or 8 levels of evidence that I can discuss with you, but we can never share on the mainstream media because they won't talk to us, to show that there is no connection now between the number of cases and the number of deaths, between those who are positive and their future clinical status. So just to show you a couple of things that tell us we are at herd immunity because the number of deaths, excess deaths in London is effectively 0. This time in spring, we were experiencing, I think it was almost 300 coronavirus deaths a day. So something has changed, and I know what it is. Now, of course, you all know what it is as well. It's herd immunity. So why are we being locked down when waves of viruses don't occur? So that's one thing. The other thing is that you may remember at the early part of the last week, again, against any precedent in this country, the British Army came into schools in Liverpool. Okay, I know they're welcomed there by the mayor, but the point is the British Army turned up and they didn't ask for parents' consent. In fact, they were told on Saturday that this was going to happen on Monday and that their consent was not sought or required. So if you don't want your child swabbed, don't bring them to school. So the British Army went through, and at the end of about 3 or 4 days, they tested 90,000 people. Nobody was held down or anything, but I'm just pointing out there was no ethics done. And you have to do ethics for the clinical studies, and it was not done. And you need informed consent, and that was not done. And it was all under the guise of public health emergency, which we don't have, apart from the one the government's caused. But anyway, when they finished testing this 90,000 people, they found levels of virus, according to this different new test made by different people, that was so low, let's almost call it zero. It's very, very low. It's at least 10 times lower than they were finding using the other tests, and probably 100 times lower than they were finding across the country. Now, that data was the best news I'd seen all year. And after the BBC briefly mentioned it, they went on to intone and today's COVID deaths. And it was like, I'm literally winking through the looking glass at this point. I'm literally looking at people telling me things that I know are not true. So in order to get out of this hole, I would urge you to lobby everybody you can, mainly your MPs, by telling them you'll never vote for them again and you will campaign against their re-election, however difficult it is for you, if they don't lobby to stop mass PCR testing. That's one thing. The other thing I would lobby them to do is to repeal the Ofcom coronavirus broadcasting guidelines. Now, these were brought in, I believe, I wasn't involved, but I've been told second and third hand that this was, well, we're going to have a health emergency and we don't want awkward people suggesting, I don't know, any kind of conspiracy theories. And so let's just have the mainstream media playing a straight bat and just telling you what the government and SAGE tells you to tell them. And that I could just about have understood that, I guess, for the first month, with a lot of people dying. Genuinely was frightening. But they didn't repeal these guidelines, and during the year they've got more and more repressive. For example, yesterday, having worked for a week with a freelance professional filmmaker, just to explain my scientific background and step-by-step walking people through the fact that we are at herd immunity and I'm not really sure what's going on. Within 10 minutes of that being posted on YouTube, it was removed. So it's kind of slightly frightening. But they do say when you're closer to the target, the flat gets more intense. So that's what I would do. I would stop the PCR mass testing. I need to lobby people to do it because the evidence is there in about 5 different ways to say that the virus is not abroad in the country. There's something wrong with the testing system, and we'll be able to be perfectly safe. I'm not even saying don't test people, just use a different testing system, and that will go away. Repeal the repressive guidelines from Ofcom, which has the effect of censorship. So you can hear from people like me and decide if I am crazy. And then the last thing I would do is repeal the Coronavirus Act itself, because I think it's bypassing the House of Commons. I think occasionally the government kind of dallies with MPs and sort of like makes as if to ask them for permission for things. But I think in practice, the government and SAGE, and I think it's really only 4 people in government, plus whoever it is, probably Whitty and Vallance, I think they're the only people driving this. It's the only important policy that's dynamic in the country. And Boris and Hancock are not numerate, and they're not scientists. And so if they're told various things are true and you need to do them, I suspect they'll just do them. And what I've said to you is they are not benign and they're not your friends and they're wrong. So I shall pause at this point. It's all rather frightening.
That was brilliant as always. I follow you online. I see a lot of your posts. So that was a great insight. I'm just going to go back to Fraser with a kind of continuation of that. We've seen the Misinformation Act from Ofcom. We've seen the NHS this week. Actually, I heard Piers Morgan and an NHS advisor talking about the government had lowballed deaths, and actually we should be locked down for Christmas. And then the BMJ posted an article last week, which was entitled "When Good Science is Suppressed by Medical Political Complex, People Die." I just want to ask, with regards to the kind of the contracts for chums and everything else that's going on, the NHS getting everything COVID related funded and underwritten. We've seen that GPs will get another £25 per person they vaccinate. There's a lot of money being thrown around, and local authorities getting huge grants to impose restrictions. Is there almost like a bribery going on with our public sector services to ensure that they toe the line? It's something I wanted to put to Fraser.
No, I wouldn't call it bribery. And also, from my own, and the way I see the debate on this side of the media fence, I'm not sure I think that the Ofcom restrictions are pretty much of a chill effect either. I know at first glance, it can seem pretty Orwellian. I hate the idea of government ever, or regulators ever telling people, broadcasters, what subject they can and can't discuss. But I spend a lot of my time trying to get a range of voices for the Spectator website. And the point is that there simply aren't that many voices on the other side. And now, that's not to say people don't think skeptical thoughts. My God, they do. They're just aware that if they go public with them, they can have their career and reputation destroyed. Look at the attacks we've seen on Professor Carl Hennigan from Oxford, on Snitra Gupta from Oxford as well. When it is now, I think that they're incredibly brave, these people, because they know when they were about to go in defiance of a scientific consensus, then they were about to basically have their names dragged through the mud, have people say well, they're crazy, but they're fringe characters. You even had Matt Hancock, the health secretary, describe Professor Hennigan as a fringe character. If you did, it was disgraceful, given that Hennigan was the one who actually discovered flaws in the COVID death data, which meant that anybody hit by a bus.
Okay, so Fraser, if it isn't maybe it isn't then the Ofcom coronavirus broadcasting guidelines, and as you say, perhaps it's people don't want to come forward and give alternative views. But I have to say, this idea of scientific consensus, I don't know a proper scientist, and I know hundreds. I don't know any of them that think that any of the things the government has done or said makes any sense. No live scientists I've spoken to, and I know hundreds, seriously. So please don't represent anything that's being done as consensus. It's not. And as you know, Carl Hennigan is just he's a clever guy. He's middle of the road. He's an evidence-based guy, and that means he's always middle of the road. So, did you really think what you said then is true, that there is a scientific consensus that supports any of the things, if not all of them? I mean, which scientists would you like to name that aren't on stage?
Right. Look, I wish I could. I wish I could agree with you there. But when I certainly see. Because it doesn't look, you do not need to go far. But if you look at basically, for example, there was an attack on the Great Barrington Declaration. There's a rival one. There's so many people on it from there.
Yes.
In my line of work, where I try to serve up debate, not write it myself, but I try to have person A saying this, person B saying that.
Yeah.
In my experience, scientific consensuses, whether they're real or manufactured, are some of the hardest things to get anybody to speak against for the ferocity of attack. On anybody who goes after what is regarded as the mainstream. And
I accept that.
That is the dynamics. I think that's more pernicious than Ofcom.
Okay, I accept that. So what you're not saying is it's actually scientific consensus. It may or may not be, and I'm saying it's not. But
perceived consensus, let's put it that way.
Yes, exactly. Once it's said to be the scientific consensus, yes, I do see that it would be dangerous to go against it. And I will be honest and say, if I was still Vice President of a Respiratory Research Advisor, I probably would not have said anything about this because, they would say, can you stop doing that, please? I'm sure they would, But because I'm an independent and because I'm very knowledgeable in a specific area, that's the point. I've spent 32 years as head of respiratory research, so I'm not a fringe figure. I can support everything I said, apart from maybe the opinion stuff, but everything about the science is true, and therefore all the stuff you hear from SAGE is not. It's not an amount of opinion. For example, when Patrick Vallance stood up and said, I think about maybe a month, 6 weeks ago, before lockdown 2, he said this memorable phrase. He said, sadly, more than 90% of the population of the UK are still susceptible.
Yeah.
It's absolutely not true. In fact,
Sorry, chaps, because we're kind of running out of time here. Can we hear from James? Because
I'll stop at this point so everybody knows my view.
Thank God for that.
I'll stop.
Dean.
Right. Yes. So I'll just bring James into this. So obviously James's background is M&A and private equity, sits on boards of different businesses. So James, question for you: the socio-economic impact of COVID is obviously going to hit businesses quite hard. Pre-COVID, reading a lot about the high levels of cash in PE, and recently about cheap debt-driven deals, especially with tax rises around the corner. How do you see M&A post-COVID? Is it going to be one of rolling up good enterprises that are cash strapped? Or is it, are there going to be lots of decent deals going on?
So firstly, you're spot on. There is a lot of money out there. There's the dry powder everybody talks about in the private equity world, looking for homes, and there's also an enormous amount of money in debt funds. So forget even the banks, just in the debt funds, all looking for a home. And the managers of these funds are all incentivized to get the money out the door quickly. so they can earn their fees and that they can also go and raise the next fund. So there's a lot of funding available. I think then when you look at the businesses, there's a lot of businesses as a result of the COVID period we've had. I've simply got the wrong capital structure now. So they've got too much debt or whatever it might be. And but underneath it all, there are fantastic businesses there that will carry on post post this period. You just got to look, as an example, at things like restaurants and bars. The market for them will come back, but those businesses at the moment will be really struggling because they've got too much debt or they can't afford to fund their working capital. They might be able to not be able to afford to actually reopen because they can't afford to buy the product in, etc. But underneath it all, they're great businesses and probably got fantastic management teams. So you've got that bit of the wrong capital structure. You've also got, particularly I think as I look at the quoted market and the sort of the small and mid cap things in the quoted market, you've got a whole bunch of businesses that are undervalued by the market. Now, whether that's COVID, Brexit, whatever it might be, the simple fact is the UK market, and Merrin's written a lot about this in Money Week, the UK market is reasonably good value, but it's partly because the lack of analysts' research on these businesses, and there's, for a lot of institutional investors, there's not necessarily a reason to buy. Thus, these assets are undervalued, and I think a lot of them will be taken off the market by private equity because they'll see the opportunity. Particularly look at private equity firms that floated the business in the first place, and therefore know the business and really know the management team, and they may well be having conversations to take them back private. I think you'll also find a lot of managers within businesses will be keen to see a transaction happen, whether it's private equity or whether it's being sold to a trade buyer. They'll like the opportunity to crystallize some of their shares and to get those their options paid up and whatever it might be, crystallize that and get a new deal with the new owners of the business. So I think there's a big incentive for managers, not necessarily for shareholders, to see some of these transactions go through. And at the end of the day, it's often management incentivization and what the management want rather than shareholder wants that drive some of these transactions. I think that there are, we will see an interesting phase with some of the weaker businesses next year as we see the banks, where they're currently banked by some mainstream banks. They're going to start turning the screws, and particularly on the OK businesses. What I saw in the 2008 financial crisis was that the banks were struggling with all the real zombie companies. And when they needed to raise liquidity themselves, what they did was they put the screws on the OK businesses because they were the ones they had more chance of getting cash back, whether it's from a sale of the business or whether it's from some sort of refinancing. So there's going to be a lot of difficult situations coming through driven by banks, but there will be plenty of deals coming because of the dry powder available.
Super. Yeah, I agree with everything you've just said, from everything I've been reading and seeing, and some of the conversations I've had with a couple of top 4 partners in the last couple of weeks. I want to go back to something that's probably a little bit more positive. And again, I'm going to reference an article in Merrin's Money Week a week or two ago. I read an interview with Jim Mellon, seasoned investor, and it was lots of stuff in there. But one of the things I pulled out from that was that what followed the Spanish flu and the 1918 was the Roaring Twenties. And could we now be following the Roaring 2020s and seeing a kind of a change of the winners and losers post-COVID?
I think we will see the winners partying, and it was raised earlier on that a lot of people have come out of this doing very well and have genuinely have pent up demand, and they've got more cash than they had. So there's definitely a reasonably large group of winners. But I look at the population and I stratify into 3 groups. You've got the clear winners out of this. You've got the worried middle, and then you've got the losers in it all. And I think that worried middle and the losers are going to be very cautious as we go forward. So I've read right from the beginning about about Merrin's V-shaped recovery, and I've always been sceptical, and even having a Twitter debate with John Stepek about this point. But I think we will see a recovery of that V, but then it's going to flatten out for a bit because I think we've taken so much demand out of the economy through the unemployment and the nervousness about what unemployment will come in the future. So. I think this is going to be very awkward for the country, because I think we are going to see the winners going off and rushing off to Spain and partying hard and being seen to be being very successful. I think we're then going to see that predominantly younger crowd who will be just worried and nervous about what's happening. And then if you, being blunt, a big passion of mine is education and how education can take you so far. I'm seriously worried about the kids and the university students at the moment who have just got a terrible start in life. And if, as a country, we need a highly skilled, highly educated, highly motivated workforce, and we are wiping out a sort of a 3 to 5 year band of that, which is not going to bode well for us as we go forward. So there are winners and there'll be really bad losers, and it's not good, that disparity between the two.
Yeah, I get that. I totally agree on the education side. I work a lot with schools. As a unit, the RDLC actually over the summer holiday period raised over 1,000 PCs and laptops to hand out to schools in areas of deprivation and with high free school meals. And I think that lack of education that they're receiving at the moment is really going to push that gap in the future, that social mobility gap between the rich and the poor. So something that does need to be addressed. I'm going to pass back to Gary. I'm just going to thank everyone. I'm going to pass back to Gary for the finishing comments.
Well, I'll just walk past the TV and loose women are discussing whether you can wear your PJs on the school run. So do you know what? So there's something for everybody in the world at the moment. I think it was wildly optimistic to think for a split second that we could run within time to talk about this debate with this panel. So can I just ask everyone, just 90 seconds, what do you think is coming next? And as business leaders ourselves that are trying to perpetuate and help UK PLC, what things do you think we should be doing for the economy and for ourselves and for the health of the nation? So, Merrin, thank you again. Brilliant as ever. Go on, 90 seconds. What's next? What should we expect? And what do you think we should all be doing? Oh, you're on mute.
Okay, ready?
The phrase of 2020. You're on mute.
You're on mute. What you should be looking for from here is continued fiscal stimulus. There is no appetite at all, whatever happens next, for anybody to pull back from any spending, not the people in power, not the people opposing them. So you have to expect ongoing fiscal stimulus. And as I said before, the merging of monetary and fiscal policy, which in the end, I can't see anything to happen except for that leading to higher inflation. And inside all businesses, you need to be ready for that.
Can I just ask, what things would impact a business if inflation starts to get superinflation? What things should we be mindful of?
Well, your costs, your costs and your market power. I mean, it's a great time we discussed this earlier, to restructure so you have the correct finance in place, for example. I mean, the last thing you want is to be a very high debt company going into something like this. You want to be sure that you have more equity financing than debt financing. You want to be sure that you can maintain your margins in the face of rising prices and falling consumer confidence. I mean, I've talked a lot about the V and the pent up demand, and I believe very strongly that we will see this when we come out. Of course, that's dependent on government policy. Remember that everything that I say about positivity in the future is dependent on government policy. The V and the W are always in the gift of the government, and in this case, of course, in the gift of SAGE. And if you don't get the vaccine coming through that gives everyone the excuse to back off from their silly policies, then you're not going to get your V. So that's all government dependent, I think it's important to say.
Well, businesses only fail when they run out of cash, right? So well said. Fraser, you're brilliant. Can I actually say that your setup here, you actually look like you're on telly. That's a brilliant setup. This is very good. And obviously you've got a face for TV as well, which does help. Sir, thank you very much. You speak amazingly well, and your intellect just comes flooding out. So thank you very much for your contribution. Again, from yourself, same question. what next? Is this going to go on forever? Are we going to have another sort of 21 that's going to look similar to this? And what might you say to business leaders? How can we align ourselves to do the best for ourselves and the country going forward?
What next is that lockdown will be replaced by something similar. Boris Johnson is trying to think his way out of this trap, but it's quite difficult for him. He basically needs help. I think the bigger risk isn't so much COVID. I think the vaccine will come along for that. But I think what we've really discovered the last few months is not COVID. What we've discovered is a completely new way that mankind reacts to new pathogens. As Mike said, we swim in a sea of viruses, but now we've got the technology to find new ones, to give them a name, to track their process right around the world. Coronavirus will not be the last. If we've now got the technology, we're facing a crisis of awareness, not so much a virus itself. So the question is, when the next one comes along, as come it will, are we going to keep doing this time and time again? Has technology, the phrase of 2020 certainly is you're on mute, but that also means people have technology that allows them to think of a lockdown as an option. This time last year, nobody would have thought it was. We've all discovered, to our amazement, that technology allows more of economic life to go on from home, and that therefore has created locking down, trying to run and hide from the virus as an option. So we will repeat, not of coronavirus, but of something else. What businesses can do is just try to make your arguments heard. My email is fraser@spectator.co.uk. If anyone on this call has got things which they've seen, studies they don't think haven't been promoted, let me know and I'll do my best to raise awareness. But do what you can to make your case, to put it in the public domain, and just put things there for others to come and pluck and weave together and take arguments. The great thing about the media now is it doesn't have to be left to journalists. Anybody can put up an online analysis, anybody can put up facts from their own business that will help give the balancing impact the government badly needs. If it's trying to think how to do this again when the next time comes, I suspect it will come before too long.
You've just given power to my argument that I've got an opinion and that you're all welcome to it. So that'd be fabulous. And we will definitely be sharing those opinions. Thank you very much indeed for your contribution again, sir. Mike.
Yes. Okay.
I kind of love you, by the way.
Okay.
I mean, literally, but none of the numbers that we've ever been looking at ever make any sense. And you just know you're brave enough to actually come from a scientific background to actually just call it out. So Thank you. That's incredibly useful. And it kind of supports everything that Dean and I have been saying across the group. This doesn't make sense. No, so again, the same question to you, sir.
Yeah. That would be,
what's the next? What can we do?
Yeah, so just in terms of the phrase of the year, actually, apart from you're on mute, is this doesn't make sense. I've heard it from thousands of people, and of course it doesn't. So, Fraser, you might be right. We've got this kind of crisis of not knowing quite how to cope. I personally think this crisis was manufactured. That is, people decided to be frightened about something that was really just happens all the time, and we just don't think about it. Probably a little bit worse than that, because 40,000 people died in the spring. So my one piece of advice, and honestly, it's worth what you paid for it, but I offer it sincerely, that the fact that 50% of us were already immune before the virus arrived, 25% if you believe even Public Health England, that's a big step forward from SAGE's 0, which they maintain to this day. And the fact that herd immunity was reached in weeks, you can just look at the data, it's very clear. What that tells you is humans are really good at getting immune to this virus. So that means you don't really need a vaccine. You certainly don't need a vaccine to terminate a pandemic because it terminated in May or June. So that's the thing. So then the next thing I would say is, I do think some vulnerable and old people probably should consider this vaccine, with informed consent. But I would strongly urge all of you to go, wait a minute, if you hear any such talk about rolling the vaccine out, mass vaccination campaigns, frighten the crap out of me, because most people are already immune. We can test for this. And the majority that aren't, unless they're already over 70 and already ill, are not at risk from the virus. Why the hell would you want to take a vaccine? Now, I'm an ex-big pharma guy. Spent all my career, apart from a bit of time in biotech, when I sold that to a big pharma. I've spent my entire life around big pharma. I'm a science guy. I'm pro-vaccine. I've had them all. All my children have had them all. I'm talked to my daughter about her grandchild and my grandson about vaccines, and have them all.
But Mike, 10 seconds. You got 10 seconds. Go,
Okay,
mate. We're on the break.
so I'm saying, if opposed with all your might, mass vaccine rollouts are not necessary. Really spooky.
Good man. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I'm glad you got some lunch in as well. James, my friend, brother. One, it's lovely to see you on screen again. It's been far too long. We've been lovely to catch up. Next time we're in home house, we catch up for a bit. Sir, same question.
Right. I think for me, it's going to be continued political confusion over the next number of months. But as we go into next year, whether we need the vaccine or not, and whether we have the vaccine or not, the vaccine and the having it will mean things open up and start to recover. And I think for this audience and your pirates here, it's very simple for me. Ignore the outside world. Focus on business efficiency. For God's sake, manage your cash and keep a very tight control on that. And then be brave. Be opportunistic.
I love that. Yeah. Always be brave. Emma, you beauty, thank you for putting this together. Dean, well done. That was brilliant. Thank you everyone for contributing, and thank you everyone for being here. Thank you guys again. For all the speakers, if you need a favour, we owe you one. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Cheers. Bye now.